This video focuses on all things recommendation letters, especially in the college setting. Asking for recommendation letters can be stressful, whether it's for a job, an internship, a summer program, or for your next college experience. And hopefully this short video is going to talk a little bit about the etiquette of recommendation letters, which no one is born knowing, who to ask, how to ask, and how to plant the seeds throughout your time as an undergraduate in order to have people who can write effective letters for you. So this is going to be pretty brief and pretty to the point. So the first thing you want to be thinking about is who to ask. Now, this might sound like a no-brainer, your professors, but amongst your professors, there are a couple of different criteria that you want to be thinking about. In particular, you want to be thinking about the longevity of the relationship and the quality of the relationship. And that might be even more important than what grade you got in their class. So, for example, it's not required that you have a great grade in their class for them to write you a good recommendation. I've written glowing recommendations for students who've earned a C in my class because I knew enough about that student and what was going on with them to be able to talk about how that C represented a pretty impressive accomplishment that predicted what I thought of as future personal and academic success. So you kind of want to think about the quality of the relationship, what that professor might know about you, what they might be able to say about you. And that's definitely more important than did I get an A in their class if, let's say, a professor you got an A with is someone you never spoke to and might struggle to write more than a couple of sentences. So you ideally want to choose someone who has had you for a full semester, like a full class, or even if you have that luxury, someone who's had you for more than one class, or someone who you've had more than one personal interaction with. Those are going to be the real qualities that you look for in terms of who you ask. If you can find somebody in your major, even better, you know. But again, if you had stronger relationships with somebody outside of your major, it's more important that you pick somebody who can speak at length and in some detail about you than that there's someone who is in your specific field of study. So kind of keep that in mind. Those are the kinds of criteria that you're going to want to weight more than others. Okay, so for example, if you've had a professor that you've only had one class with, but you've had more interactions with than someone you've had only had more classes with, go with them. One thing I would just like to bring up, because it has come up a few times in my career, is that unless you've had a very strong relationship with an academic advisor, they're generally not as an effective letter writer for you. And the reason for that is really rooted in the ways that academic recommendation forms are structured. So to pull back the curtain just a little bit, most academic forms for a recommendation letter are actually online forms that start with a sort of multiple choice section and then give you a place to either free write or more likely upload a fuller recommendation letter, ideally, which should be at least really about a page single spaced, right? Which should give you an idea of how much a person should know you. But that first multiple choice slash sometimes it's like a rating system section will almost entirely or almost every time start with, how long have you known this person? Question one. Question two, in what capacity? So were you their professor, their advisor? Then they'll tend to ask a series of related questions that aren't the exact same on every application, but that are very similar. They'll be like, well, what do you see as their academic strengths or promises, 1 to 5? How good are they at writing, 1 to 5? Sometimes I've seen how mature are they, 1 to 5? How creative are they? 1 to 5. How good are they at problem solving? 1 to 5. Those kinds of things. But a lot of those questions tend to be pretty specific to an academic environment. And that's something that an academic advisor is probably not going to have the same context for. So they have a 1 to 5 and then a not able to evaluate. And if you have a lot of not available to evaluates, that makes it a lot harder for a committee to really judge. And so if they've got two kind of similar applications next to them, and one of them has a lot of glowing numbers and another has, a lot of, I don't know, you can see how that might disadvantage you. So kind of try to keep that in mind. So what you're trying to do is you want to be thinking about someone who's seen you in the classroom and someone who's had enough contact with you, whether because you spoke a lot in class or because you've gone to office hours or you've had conversations before or after class that would make you memorable to them, that they can not only fill out a form with a bunch of numbers, but they can also write a letter that paints a picture of you. Okay, you've picked your professor. How do you ask? Number one, you actually have to do a little bit of legwork, or at least I would recommend that you do a little legwork. One, you have to determine what type of format your professor will have to use to submit their recommendation. So basically there are two types. There are three types. There's kind of like the common application, which is sort of a mass form, in which case they make one recommendation and then it could kind of go to most, if not all, of the schools you're applying to, if it's schools. There are specific applications that are specific to a particular program, an internship, a job, right? And so those might be very specific and individuated to whatever specific opportunity you're asking them to write about you for. And sometimes those are usually also online because we're in the 2020s, but occasionally, especially with smaller programs and some private schools, you will see still, and it just happened to me in the last week, you will see programs that will have a single individuated paper recommendation letter. And the reason why I bring this up is that there are different things you have to do for each of these. For an online form, almost across the board, what they will ask you to do is they will ask you to give the professor's professional email. So if you also have their Gmail or their personal email for whatever reason, that is not the email to use. You have to use their school email because that's part of the verification process to make sure they're the real person. Keep that in mind. If it's a paper version, typically the process involves you filling out the top of the form with your personal information and then sending it or taking it to that professor who will complete the form and then attach their letter once they've written it, usually on school letterhead or some approximation thereof. And then they will either send it themselves, or if it has to be included in your packet, they will seal it in a letter, like an envelope, and sign across the flap. And that has to do with maintaining privacy. There is generally an expectation that recommendations are private, so that the recommender feels free to be honest in what they say about you. I know that in some professions, in some positions, there's less secrecy about the whole thing, but academia is by and large not like that. I've had cases where students have said, oh, I'll write the letter for you and then you can use that as a template and change it and then sign it. And I'm going to tell you that that's, for most of your professors, not going to fly. Because it really violates a kind of sense of the way that recommendations do and should work. They tend to be, I won't say secretive, but they tend to have a sense that in order to be valid, they should be confidential. Some recommendation letters have an option for the student or the person being referred to, right, to say whether or not they waive their right to see what the recommender said. But that's also somewhat rare. And also the recommender can also, in some cases, waive the right for it to be confidential. That all depends on the specific recommendation process of the school or institution. But in general, you can assume that your professors will presume that you will not know what they have to say about you. Okay, so just be aware of that. The other thing you should be aware of is the due dates and requirements for your application. So for example, if one of the things you do when you ask them is you tell them when it's due. This is also really important because we're about to get into the etiquette of asking for a recommendation letter, and the due dates are actually a key part of that process. So number one, a really important part of the etiquette of asking is that you give a minimum of 2 weeks notice for when you ask before the due date. That is the bare minimum. I would say that courtesy would suggest that you give a month. If you don't have that month, make sure you have two weeks, because of course this is in addition to your professor's everyday schedule, and a professor will want to take some time, right, to develop your letter and to send it, and they also want a little bit of time in case there are any glitches, right, in the process, that there's some time to kind of work around those glitches and not jeopardize your application. So 2 weeks is the bare minimum. I would recommend giving them a month as a courtesy. Okay, so if you are emailing your request, I would recommend that in your email, your first sentence should give your name, what class you were in with them, and what semester you took that class with them. Especially if they're online, what that's going to help them do is to call up your old work, their comments on your work, and that's going to really help them say concrete things about you. If you're in person with them, and they're going to hopefully remember you, but it's still a good idea to remind them what year and semester it was. Also, if you're talking to them in person and it was an in-person class, it's a really good idea to bring back maybe the work that you were happiest with in their class with their comments, or if there's some kind of a keystone assignment in the class, a final paper, a final research project, something like that. That's something that's really good to bring with them. It not only refreshes their memory, but it gives them something concrete to talk about. So for example, when I try to write letters for my 101 students, I really usually like to talk about either the paper they're proudest of, or that they got the highest grade on, or their final paper. And I like to quote bits of it to give an idea of their writing style. If I don't quote, if I don't find something that's super quotable, I like to talk about what their thesis is and how it demonstrates some of their strengths as a student. Because again, remember, one of the things that we're trying to do is make you stand out amongst other applicants by painting a really clear picture of who you are academically and personally from an academic point of view, like from a professor's point of view. So you want to be thinking about that. You want to give us the tools to write you the best letter that we can. With that in mind, other than old work, other things you might want to think about. Also, if let's say you had electronic copies, then that would be online. Let's say you don't have a graded copy of the work, but you still have the file that you saved to your computer. That could be a last resort. And you can say, I don't have the copy you wrote on. You don't have to tell them you burned it or whatever, or that you moved. You can just say, I don't have that anymore, but I do have this electronic copy. They can kind of skim it and still mine it for details to talk about you. But what you want to do is you want to give them all the tools possible to paint a picture of you. You can also, if you think it's useful if you have a CV or a resume that involves things like student activities you're in. We can say, oh, and they did all, they did this exemplary work, or they put in this extra time into our class, even while they were doing these other things. If there's something that really would like to highlight out of that, I mean, you won't know if we ever followed that direction, but you can actually, you can absolutely tell us, hey, these are some things I was really proud of, if you could mention that. Sometimes your professors can say things that maybe you might not find a place for in your personal essay. And so you can lead us to that. I had a student who I didn't know some of his activities at the time he was in my class, which really blew me away, because considering the time he was putting into my class, that was even more impressive. I had no idea until he gave me his resume. So you can tell us those things. Okay. Now, you've given them the information. You've asked them. You might wait to give them the extra information until they've given you an answer. There are basically 3 different kinds of answers they might give you. They might say no. And obviously that would be somewhat disappointing. It might have to do with what's going on in their time. They might not know enough about you. They might have had a very neutral, mediocre, or negative experience with you, or they just could be so swamped right now that they just don't think they could write you a good letter. I would generally take it as a good thing if somebody tells you no, not that it isn't disappointing and stressful, but if they're telling you no, what they're basically saying is, in good conscience, the letter I would write you is not going to make you competitive. I think you should go to somebody else. And you want to know that, right? You don't want them to say, oh, sure, I'll write you a letter. And then they write you a terrible letter and tank your opportunities, right? So as awful as it is for them to say, it's better than the alternative. They may give you what might feel like mixed signals, but is actually a soft no. And I found that sometimes students don't quite always interpret that in the ways that faculty intend. So there have been cases where I've told students, I can write you a letter, but I think you should ask someone else. That's what we call a soft no. So I've had students who I didn't know very well, and I was concerned that I couldn't write them a competitive letter, whether because I was their advisor and not their teacher, or because, we'd never had conversations and their work was not super strong. So it didn't give me a lot to say, right? And in those cases, it's better to be able to check all of the boxes in that you have a complete application to have enough numbers. So I'm not going to tell you no, but I think that if you have any other options, you probably have in the time that you've been here, because if you're applying to other schools, you've certainly had around 15 professors at that point, that the time you're looking to apply to other schools. I'm hoping that you have better options than me. Even if I might feel approachable, I still might not be the person who's going to write you a super effective letter just based on our time together. That's what we call a soft no. I can write you a letter, but I don't think it's the best letter that's going to get you the best results. I've had students disregard that and say, well, I want you to write it anyway, and I've done my best for it. But I am not going to lie. So I will put the best face on our experience that I can, but those letters tend to be very short or fairly short. And a committee can tell when the praise seems to be a little stretched or very limited in nature. And they're certainly going to know if you say, well, I haven't known them long, right? Like I just got them in class 4 weeks ago, they can tell if it's a this semester student that I may have only had a couple of weeks with this student. And that's going to raise some questions as to, well, why aren't they asking any of their other professors? right? So you kind of want to think strategically about that. There are reasons if your professor gives you that kind of mixed signals answer. If they're all you've got, then you go with it. But you might want to ask around a little bit more, okay, and see what your best options are. Okay, say neither of those two less optimal outcomes happens and your professor says yes, right? Then again, I would consider sending them a graded, ideally, or if you don't have that, an ungraded copy of your most developed, right, the end of the semester, or your highest graded but substantial work from the class, or the work that you were most proud of. So that they have something specific to highlight in their letter. In my case, it usually only shows up in one paragraph, but it's still something really concrete that gives you a little bit more of a voice in your own recommendation letter. Again, you could send a full or partial resume, or even just a little bit of a note in an email saying, if you could mention XYZ, that would be really important to me, because it's on my resume, but there really wasn't anywhere else for me to talk about it. Your professor may do it, they may not if it doesn't fit in anywhere, but we'll usually try to accommodate that. Again, do not offer to write their letter for them. It's a little insulting, and it looks a little not above board. And again, that I think is largely an artifact of sort of American academia. You may have a few outliers who are fine with that, but in general, it's going to look a little sketch to most of your professors, so I don't recommend it. Okay, one way that you can kind of lay your groundwork in advance for this is throughout the time that you're at your institution, go to office hours. Check in with your professors about assignments ahead of time, and just kind of strategize your assignments. Check in with them after class to just talk about the readings. We don't see that as brown nosing, right? That time is set aside for you. But what you're doing in those cases is you're developing relationships with your professors. And you're making it really easy for us to start off our letter by saying, hey, so-and-so went above and beyond. They went to office hours. We talked about all kinds of things. We talked about these things having to do with class. I got a real sense of their personality, and it actually does give us a sense of your personality. So we can talk about that. We can build a picture of you as a student, but also as a whole human being that they want to add to their community. So it just really makes it easier for us to flesh you out for this committee, who basically has a lot of paperwork about a lot of people, many of whom the recommenders maybe don't know their students very well. As a practical matter, you might not go to every single professor's office hours, but I would recommend at least trying it in 2 of your classes every semester, so that you have multiple options of people with whom you've tried to create a rapport with, so that they're going to remember you. And hopefully you also feel more comfortable asking, because it is really stressful to ask somebody to write a letter for you. And hopefully if you've built up a little bit of a comfort with that person, that comfort is going to carry over to your request. And also when you say, hey, I'm so-and-so from last semester, they're going to remember you. I'm going to tell you right now, one of the best things you can do to develop yourself as a student and as someone who's sort of professionalizing yourself in certain ways, go to office hours, have those conversations. Even if it's just, hey, we were talking about this in class and it didn't the conversation went in this other direction, but I was kind of hoping we'd talk about this. Or, hey, we talked about this part of the text in class, but this other part is giving me some trouble and I'd like to talk about it before I start my paper. Or, I'm looking at the paper assignment and I'm thinking about writing about this. Is that a good direction to take, or would you recommend I do something else? Hi, we have a visitor. Any of those are great ways to start a conversation in office hours. And those are just great ways to just start to build a picture in your potential recommender's mind of someone who is invested in the class and also is a whole human being, because while of course we're invested in our students, that's why we're teachers. It's really hard to get a sense of each of our students in a classroom where we often have upwards of 25, 30 people in there. If you're a kind of shy person in class, we might not get a full sense of you from classroom interaction. And in particular, in these online environments that we're in quite a bit now, we might never have even seen your face. And we might not in office hours if you don't feel comfortable turning your camera on, but we're still going to get a rounder picture, right? A deeper picture of you in office hours. So I strongly recommend that you kind of put in that little bit of investment now, because the chances are your undergraduate professors, both at this level and at your four-year institution, are going to be your recommenders for a while. Both in academic endeavors and in some professional endeavors. So that kind of investment that you put in here, even if it's 20 minutes here and a half hour there, could have really big payoffs later, both in the short term in the class, but really long term in terms of the letters they can write for you. And then the other thing that I would just mention is that most of us keep those letters. So if you need a letter again later, we may be able to access that. And I've had that with a student who went on, applied to schools, went to a school, didn't like it, took a couple years off because she had a great job opportunity, and then decided to go back to school. And when that happened, she approached me again and said, can you write me another letter? And I updated the letter with some of the new experiences this student had had that I thought made her a really cool applicant. But I still had the base of her original letter, because at this point it had been almost 3 years since I had, been in a classroom with her. Right? So, those investments that you put in may have not only one-time benefits, but they can trickle down for years and years and years after that. So that's basically it. I hope that's useful to you. I hope that makes the whole process a little bit clearer, and hopefully a little bit less stressful. But go forth, go to office hours and ask your professors for recommendations, and may you all be successful. Take care.